Basically, the U.S. men's team got gold in the Olympiad. It's the first time that's actually happened since 1976, I believe. So quite a while. So it's a big deal. So what I thought I'd do is, because it's a middle game class, I'd go over some of the middle games from it. And interestingly enough, I think that the match was decided actually by what happened in the middle game. So it was like they knew I was giving this lecture and they played their games accordingly. So I'll kind of take the games one by one. So basically the first game on board one, so we were playing against Canada, who actually had a pretty tough team. And their board one is a player, Evgeny Bareev, who used to be actually one of the top 10 in the world back in the late 90s. But he's, he basically very rarely plays now. His rating's gone down, but obviously he's still a very classy player. Apparently Canada is where Russian GMs go when they're older and retired or whatever. But obviously still a very capable player. However, I'd say that his openings are probably not what they used to be. He used to be like almost impenetrable in the French and Caruana systems. Probably not the case anymore. And of course, Fabiano was white, and he's extremely well prepared. So Bareev got a position which I'll be generous and call it suspicious. But okay, before we even continue from here, what do you guys think? And one of the things I do a lot when I lecture or when I teach, usually my students complain about it, is that I'm always asking what's going on in the position to summarize before we look for any moves. So what's going on here? Yes. Go ahead. Yep.
White has extra space and more pieces.
Extra space, I'm completely on board. What do you mean by more pieces?
More active pieces.
More active pieces, I got you. Very good. The bishop, the bishop on g4, the knight on d4 is a beauty. Bishop on g3 is actually kind of nice because it can be offensive after f5 and holds the position together. So very nice. Any other observations? The rook had to go to h6 in order to defend e6, and even if it didn't, I think castling kingside looks a touch on the suicidal side. And he may live in Canada now, but I don't think that that's on his mind. So castling queenside definitely makes a lot more sense. White's pawns are advanced over there, but it doesn't look easy for white to open lines on the queen side, right? And it's pretty clear that white's idea is mostly going to be centrally based. Yeah?
All of black's pawns are on white squares, so if you can exchange his stars for bishop, then
It's very true. And I like that you're thinking about this position in a positional way. Like, if your opponent has all pawns on light squares, you want to stick them with their light squared bishop and trade off their dark squared bishop, right? But the one thing I would say is that you have to watch out for this kind of thinking in a position like this. A position like this looks very tactical, right? It's a mess. The pieces are kind of scattered. There's white's king is very open. Black's king is okay for now, but could also be opened after a move like f5. It's a very tactical position, which means that the fact that white, the dark squares could end up weak might be meaningful later, but you're probably not going to be thinking, okay, I want to trade off this bishop and trade to an endgame and win because I have the dark squares. It's so unlikely at this point just because there are so many pieces on the board and the game is so complex. So let's go forward. So one of the observations is definitely something that Bareev was looking for. He realized that, okay, my position is really not so great. If I just castle or play, some kind of lame move, I'm going to get hit with f5 and probably I'm just going to lose. So how did he try to get counterplay from the black side? What move comes to mind? Yeah? Very good. And that is indeed what he played. He's like, all right, it may open up my king if I castle over there, but I need to get my pieces out. I need to get my queen out. I need to make white's king feel at least a little insecure. So he did this. White took. Obviously, the knight on d4 is a beauty. Doesn't want to move that anywhere. So it takes. He took with the queen, probably to get out of f5 type moves. So what now? How would you proceed? Yes? Now, have you seen the game? Huh?
No.
Okay. Well, very good then. Why king h1?
Because I'm diagonals.
Scared, huh?
Just a prophylactic move to get out of the pin.
Yeah, it certainly is. And by the way, it's okay to be scared sometimes. If you're never scared when you play chess, you're probably going to get checkmated a lot. It's very true. There are some people who are never scared. I have a student like this. Well, we'll be playing, he'll be like, what do you mean? There's no danger here. I'm like, okay. We play a few moves and his king's out on like e5 and he's getting surrounded by pieces. He's like, what's the problem? I don't get it. And the whole point is that, yes, you need a sense of danger. Now, is white's king in danger just yet? Probably not, right? But why would you want to have your knight pinned? Why would you, to rush with f5 here, I think would be a big mistake. And apparently Caruana subscribed to your line of thinking because he did play king h1. No huge rush. Wow, this is really big font. I like this actually. It makes it feel like what I wrote is like really important. All right. So, king h1. Black castle. He's like, all right, I'm out of here. The strange thing is the king's actually not all that safe. So what now? I believe one of you actually pointed out this feature of the position earlier in the lecture, and now is your chance to actually fix the problem with white's position. How could you improve white's position? Well, I'm glad we have an indecisive moment now. So we can all choose between knight a3 and knight d2. What are the features of each move? Where does the knight on a3 threaten to go? He chose d2, which I agree with, because he can threaten to go to d3. The knight can go to f3 in some cases, probably not now, but later. And it's just, it's a more centralized square. Of course, you guys have heard of the rule, knights on the rim are dim, that kind of thing. And sometimes it's not true, but I'd say here the knight on a3 really is not impressive. I like it on d2 a little better. Does that make sense? Alrighty, knight d2. Finishing development. All right. This is awesome. Okay. So, queen takes c3 is not a good move. Yep. Just making sure you guys are awake, that's all. I know this is too easy for you. All right. So you don't want to give up his queen. This guy used to be top 10 in the world. He's not going to take on c3. So instead he played rook h8. So now there's this kind of a thing. The pawn on h5's getting hit. Who knows? Maybe eventually those rooks will line up with the king. So this was actually the first really, I wouldn't call it a difficult move necessarily, but the first like real important move, which was really strong that he found. But in order to find this move, you have to really be looking at the whole position. And this is something I like to encourage. I think it's too often people get too focused on where they're playing. Like say you want to attack the king. You're focused only on the queen side and you miss something on the king side, for example. Or you're trying to expand in the center and miss that your king can get hit on the h-file. It's very common for club players to kind of just get too focused on one side of the board or one part of the board. So looking globally is something which in general GMs do pretty well. And it's funny, even if you notice it, when I walk around the chess club and I'm looking at watching people play their games, very often they'll even have their eyes exactly pointed to one part of the board. Whereas when I'm playing a game, I almost never do that. I'm almost always leaning back. Sometimes I have a coffee. But the main point is that I'm, looking at the whole board all the time. And I think that it's a good habit to get into because if you don't look at the whole board, you're often going to miss some detail in the position. And in some cases, that detail is instrumental to playing the position well or finding the proper moves. So look for any little detail you can here, because this is something that no one's pointed out yet. I realize this is a fairly quiet audience for the most part, but so the pawn on e6 is definitely a weakness, but it's not immediately takeable. Oh. Well, c4 allows queen takes d4, so it's probably not bad. Queen e1. So what's the point of queen e1? So this was the detail which I was talking about. The knight on h4 is really an awkward piece. And as Alex pointed out, I mean, if you attack it, like, where is it going?
If you play queen e1, can't you take on h5?
That is actually what happened. So, f5 is also a decent move, by the way. But queen e1, I think, is even stronger. Because now, black's really forced to take on h5. Because if you don't take on h5, what are you doing? Knight goes back to f5, you just take it twice, probably with either piece, and it's just killing. Keep in mind, once the f and e pawns don't have anything in front of them anymore, they're just going to start rolling. And by the time those pawns get to e6 and f6, black's going to be probably crying. So it's important that black not allow that. So black takes the pawn on h5. So first of all, I definitely like what you said about the h-file. The bishop on g3 may look kind of silly, but it actually is a very important piece because it defends this pawn on h2. As long as this bishop's on g3, these rooks and all these pieces are kind of like Christmas ornaments. They don't really do much. They look nice, but they're not doing anything because they can't crack through on h2. So taking on e6 is good. However, the way you determine it, the one phrase which I really didn't like, I hate to pick on you for this, but it's great, then I'll do it all the time, is that it looks complicated. Like, that's never ever a reason to play a move, unless maybe you're dead lost, and any attempt to complicate the game makes it so you don't lose as fast. There are some situations where you make that kind of practical call. Here, especially when you think you're close to winning, and, spoiler alert, but white is definitely winning here. So you want to make sure that you're calculating even harder. And this is, again, one of the mistakes which I think that amateur players tend to make, and even players who are masters and even strong masters. I certainly have made this mistake many times, which is that when you have a winning position, people tend to kind of lax off and not want to calculate as much. When you're winning, you actually need to calculate more, because usually what it means is that you have to calculate tactics to win the game. If you're playing an opponent who's just hanging their pieces and not putting up any resistance, there are times when you can just roll over them and not have to calculate anything. I would say that's a rare thing. When you have a winning position, usually against a strong opponent especially, you have to calculate a lot to find the win and to force a win, usually. So in this position, if Caruana had been like, well, I don't know, knight e6, bishop e6, they both look okay, I'll just pick one, he probably would have, not chosen as well. I guarantee you he sat here for at least 10 minutes, or at least at some point, maybe he did the previous move, and really calculated, really made sure which one was better. So why don't you guys do that now? Calculate it, not raise your hand. You'll get a chance to reveal your great calculation later. Now, calculation doesn't mean calculating deeply all the time. Sometimes it's just one or two moves accurately. And maybe both captures are good. This is another thing that can happen. But okay, I see what you're saying. I think that actually both moves are completely winning. There are some cases where almost all your moves are going to be good, and sometimes those cases are harder to play than times when you have to find only one continuation. So what I would recommend is try to find a crystal clear win, without allowing as little play as possible, and then, kind of just play it. Like, you might have something the computer says, this is half a pawn better, it's plus 4.5 instead of plus 4. Doesn't really matter, usually. Usually what matters is that you calculate well and that you find a good... So he chose bishop takes e6, and I think the simple reason is that he thought, as you did, that the knight is great on d4. Why would I move it? So he really liked this bishop takes e6 a little bit better. Knight takes, I think, is totally winning, though, because if queen goes back, I just bring the knight back, and okay, you can go to g6, but there are no real threats. Even if I take this bishop, I don't see how you're really doing anything, and I've just won a pawn for free, basically. So this would also win. But the way he did it was nice, because now this bishop on h5 doesn't really make any sense, right? Just kind of sitting there. All these pieces are really funny, but they're not really doing much. And meanwhile, you're still pinned. The knight on d4 is still very nice. And there's just nothing's going to go wrong with this. And sometimes that's the way you do it. You think you're totally winning. You calculate, you make sure you're being accurate, but what's going to go wrong here? There's nothing even to look at. Rook takes e6, knight takes e6. There's no discoveries. The knight on d2 covers f3, so you don't have to worry about bishop f3. Incidentally, that's maybe another reason he chose the d2 square, to cover f3. And yeah, from here on, it was pretty simple. He played bishop back to e8, trying to hold on for dear life. White advanced the pawns. And pretty soon, yeah, I mean, if black has to move every piece to the back rank, it's usually not a good sign. Rook f4, which was clever. He wanted to provoke this move in order to go back. Now, why would he do this? This looks kind of unnecessary, right? Like, why are you provoking the pawn to g5? You don't have to raise other people's hands. It's fine. Yeah?
That's fun.
Mm-hmm. So now the e and f pawns are passed. And that's kind of what won him the game. With the pawn on g7, it was harder to advance them. So he provoked g5, and now he just solidifies his position a little bit, starts pushing. And again, he might have had quicker wins here, but it doesn't matter, right? His main thing is he wants everything defended, and he wants his pawns to push. And a couple moves later, and black decided this was enough. So yeah, so f7, and now, I mean, it's just pretty bad. So that game, I would say, not a lot of resistance by black. I mean, it was a really tough position, but his opening position was pretty bad. And then some accurate middle game play. Notice he wasn't in a rush at first. He played king h1, knight d2. Then queen e1 was a really nice move, targeting the h4 knight. And then, as we saw, black's position just totally fell apart. Life, of course, is not always this easy, especially when you're playing on this kind of level. So let's look at a game where things were actually not so simple at all. So this was Wesley So's game against Alexandre Lesiege. Again, kind of a Canadian GM who's definitely a strong player, but doesn't play very often. So I guess, again, it's like all the players are coming out of retirement for the Olympiad, apparently. But he didn't have a bad tournament at all. He played very well, despite not playing very much. So they got to this position. It was a little bit interesting. But okay, so they got here. So I'm going to do what I always ask, which is what? To summarize the position. So what's going on? Keep in mind, even simple observations can really be important to any position. Claiming that white's winning is pretty bold. I would not agree with that. I think with best play, maybe white's better, but it's not super easy. So white does have connected pass pawns. That's a definite advantage. This pawn on c4 could be a weakness if you're able to take it, but it could also be a strength potentially, right? So pawns like this, I'd say you have to be wary of because they can change over the course of the game. For now, this pawn, I would say, is not super strong, but in a few moves, it could become a monster. If it gets to c3 and c2, then you could really regret calling this pawn weak. So pawns like this, you have to be very careful of. The connected passers, I'd say, are also situational. For example, if the bishop lands on d5 and blockades those pawns, are they really that strong? Probably not. But if those pawns get rolling, if white can play d5, d6 here, or something like that, then it's, could be just really, really bad for black. So judgment matters sometimes as much as calculating properly does in a position like this. You have to realize that, okay, are these pawns a strength or a weakness? Because it varies. It's not like connected pass pawns are always super strong. Sometimes they just fall. So you have to judge it by a case-by-case basis. So there are actually two moves which I think should be considered here. And one I think is definitely a stronger approach than the other. White could play d5 here, trying to advance the pawns. Trying to play either takes the bishop or play d6, something like this. Or white could play knight to d2, trying to target this c4 pawn and claim that, yes, it is a weak pawn. But okay, I mean, from what I heard, you guys were saying, well, the pawns are strong, the pawns are overextended. You don't know until you calculate. The only way you're going to know is by calculating. So as Alex pointed out very correctly, d5 is a mistake because after rook d8, d6, takes, queen here, and the pawn on c5 is going to fall because white can play queen to d4, defending both the rook and the pawn, but then rook c8, and the problem is that, yes, your pawns are pretty, they're moving along, but they don't have any friends. Queen on d4 is the only thing that can defend these pawns. Pawns need some friends in order to survive in this world. So this pawn, the reason why this pawn is a strength is because this bishop helps defend it. So, but these two pawns are just going to drop and black's going to have a significant advantage here. White can try taking this pawn, but both these pawns falling is going to be a much bigger deal. Does that make sense? So very nice. Which is why Wesley did not opt for that one. He played knight d2, as was suggested. So black has a couple options. Now, I'm actually curious. Why do you think b5 was not played? Because it wasn't.
Queen F3.
It creates a connected pass pawn. Queen f3 looks like a reasonable move to me. I was thinking also knight e4 might be strong.
Okay.
Because I think if you come into d6, that knight is going to be pretty nasty. Also notice that white has the two connected passers, whereas black only has a protected pass pawn. So this is where the doubled pawns are not really that useful in the game. So I think that white would just be much better here. But I like your queen f3 move a lot as well. Maybe it's even stronger, because now you're threatening to play d5, d6. And here, d5, d6 is quite strong, because you have 3 pawns that are connected. So black instead took the pawn and played queen b4. So what now? So what I would recommend is calculating a little bit before you decide on a move. Just you know, recommendation. Because you have lots of options here, and it's probably important. For example, queen f3 defends the rook and puts the queen on a nice active square, but then maybe you have to deal with a move like bishop d5, hitting your queen, and if you take the bishop, then the rook hangs. Queen c1 is possible, trying to target the c-pawn, but maybe black can try to target the d-pawn in response. Maybe you want to move the rook, but that could lead to c3 happening. So you have to calculate, you have to figure these things out. Which options make the most sense, which ones have the fewest drawbacks. And again, as was pointed out before, there's no substitute but to calculate. So. Okay, so knight to e4 is definitely a possibility. I like the fact that it defends and attacks, which is, hey, I'm getting to it. I see the move. Take it easy. I like the fact that this knight defends the rook on c3 and also attacks. And it also opens up the queen. So for example, d5 is a move. However, as was pointed out by two very energetic young children, f5 is a possibility. And one of the problems you have now is because your rook is defended only by the knight, if this knight gets attacked, then there's a big problem, right? Because you have no way to defend it. You can throw in this check, but I play king g7, and now you have 2 pieces attacked. And I'm not exactly sure you have a good solution to this problem. It may not be just dead lost right away. The king has to go to f6 to take that knight. Maybe the king will be exposed, but probably this isn't what you're looking for, right? So, and this is something you have to be careful with. Like if you defend a piece with a move like knight e4, you have to make sure that knight does not get attacked. So, any other ideas? Rook e3 is a move. So why did you decide on e3?
Because if you play...
So you seem to be attracted to this exchange sack. Now, exchange sacks are a great thing to learn. I would say that it's a trick that, you know, strong master players use all the time, sacking in exchange. But you have to pick and choose your moments. Here, I wouldn't be really like going out of my way to sack on e6. If the need arises in some positions, it might be a great idea. But for the time being, I don't see why I should really want to sack in exchange for that guy just yet. The bishop on e6 is nice, it defends the pawn, but to go out of my way to sack for it, probably not. E3 is a pretty active square, but I wouldn't say it's even the most active. Right now, the rook hits the pawn on c4, which is a weakness. The rook on e3 hits the bishop on e6, which I would say is not a weakness. So rook e3 is definitely possible.
So queen f3, bishop d5, queen g.
Hmm?
So queen f3, bishop d5.
Yeah, that's very possible. This move is playable, but again, I mean, I'd be worried about c4, and even, by the way, if I play a move like f5, it's not clear to me that your rook is well placed here. Next, I can play c3, maybe I can play rook to a2, maybe rook to d8. It's just not clear to me you're doing anything too great here. So I like this queen f3 move a lot, because it defends the rook, but you're also planning to maybe play rook fc1 and take this pawn. Maybe in some cases you can take the pawn here. And you also have d5 ideas. So black finds kind of an interesting move with bishop d5. So now there's actually a dilemma. There are 2 main options. And again, it's not clear which one is better. Because queen g3 is a move, but it's also not what was played in the game. And keep in mind, I mean, Wesley So is, you know, 2780, so he's a pretty good player at least. So maybe he found a move that's worth considering. Knight e4, bishop takes e4, I think you're going to be in big trouble. So it's possible to take this bishop, right? Sacking the exchange, which seems to be something you like to do. So what happens after queen takes d5? Incidentally, queen g3 I think might even be slightly stronger. The idea being it's very simple, but the point is that next move you're going to be able to play rook b1 or rook c1, And then you have a powerful maneuver, which is the rook will move here, and this knight, which looks okay, but you might not be able to win this pawn outright. You can play knight f1 to e3, and then this bishop's going to be weak, the pawn's weak, you're ready to push your pawns. And that's probably very good. So there are times when actually the simple solution is a very nice way to play. Queen takes d5, though, certainly is very tempting. And I have to say that if I were playing white, the likelihood I would take this bishop is pretty high. Because after queen takes c3, white has a very powerful move. Very good. Knight takes c4 would be a big mistake because... I know. Knight takes c4 would be a mistake because there's rook a4 and then there's the knight and pawn. Well, rook d8, knight d6. So, yeah, and queen takes c4 allows queen takes knight. So knight e4 is very strong, the idea being knight takes f6. So black's up the exchange, but black's king is clearly quite weak here. So black played here. White took this pawn with check. King h8. So he played knight d7. So he's attacking the rook. This pawn is going to be weak as well. And sometimes queen e5 check is going to be very, very strong. So black played rook e8. White brought the knight back to e5, double attacking the queen and the pawn. Another strong move. But here, black actually has one clearly best move, which stays in the game. Without this move, he should probably be losing. So the key is to find the correct move. And this is a very difficult question, so do take your time. So I think that you should move your queen, but the question is where?
Closer to the king, so it looks like you're getting attacked.
And that is exactly what black did. Unfortunately, he was not correct. The queen he played queen back to f5, which is a very human, totally natural move. The problem is that white has two good options. White can play knight takes f7 and back, or what he did in the game, which was much simpler, which was just to take this pawn. So now black has no counterplay, and white has the two connected passes, which, okay, the game didn't actually go according to plan quite yet, but this should be good enough. In general, I mean, two connected passers and a knight compared to a rook, I would take the connected passers and a knight 9 out of 10 times. You know, they're just, I mean, once the pawns get farther advanced, the rooks are just kind of powerless. Now, if the rooks are super active, it's a different matter. Or if the pawns are weak, as we've discussed. But for the moment, I mean, this should just be winning. So the key is, can black avoid this in any way? Black has a very tricky move here. And not only is this move strong objectively, it actually contains two or more traps.
Sacrifice.
Rook takes e5?
Yeah.
That would be good, but there's a problem. Queen takes a8 check, rather than taking your rook, and then I take the rook back, so I'm up a whole rook. But I would say that rook takes e5, queen takes e5 check, probably my c pawn might be a little quicker than yours. But it's a good idea. I mean, you don't want to be bound to the idea of you have to move your queen, right? Sacking the exchange back should always be on your mind. So I like that you were thinking on these along these lines, but I think that in this particular case, it's just not the best move. So yeah, why queen e2?
He can't take, if he takes with the queen, then you have rook takes e5, and if he takes with the knight, you have queen takes f1.
Well, takes with the knight is check.
No, on c4.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Well, yeah, he probably plays knight takes f7.
Yeah, so very nice. Queen e2. So this is the trick. If queen takes,
e5.
rook takes e5, the queen's attacks, and if trades, you win a whole piece. If knight takes, as was nicely pointed out, queen takes f1 check is a nasty shot. Because now if king takes, rook a1 is mate.
Wow.
Yeah. And this is why, you know, and by the way, playing for queen e2, it's not like you're playing, you know, cheap chess. All right, I'm going to trick my opponent. Sometimes when you're worse, trying to trick your opponent is actually the best way to play. But in this case, it's not so much a trap. It's more that when you play queen e2, you want your queen on the most active square. The queen is best on e2 because it defends c4, hits the rook, and sets up this idea with rook takes e5. So not only is it a tricky move and your opponent could blunder, but it's a very strong move as well. What I'd avoid doing, which I'd find, again, club players tend to do this a little too much, which is that they try to play for tricks while worsening their position. They put pieces on bad squares to play for tricks. I would say this is a bad way to do it. However, if you can put your pieces on good squares and you can, you know, play actively with your pieces, and still there's a trick. It's kind of like an added bonus to me. Now, do I think Wesley would have fallen for this? No. But queen e2 would definitely have been a step closer to saving the game. I think the best white can do now is take the pawn and go back. Yeah, going to d6 would be ill-advised. So going back here, so now the rook's cut off. So there's no mate if you take on f1. But this position is just a mess, because now, okay, the black king's completely open, but this pawn could become dangerous if it gets to c2. So most likely, I think the game would actually end in perpetual with best play. I don't know exactly how it would happen, but yeah. So queen e2 would have been a nice find, but he played here. Queen takes c4. And now you think, okay, well, he's got this now, right? It's not so easy. So he plays king g7. So in this, I think around here, Wesley starts to go straight. Now, it's move 27 in a complex game. It wouldn't surprise me if some time pressure was involved. I would bet you almost anything that black was in time pressure. Whether white was in time pressure is another matter. I'm not sure. But so the question is, how do you approach this position? What do you do? Well, what exactly is your main advantage here? Well, the knight on e5 is kind of active. The pawns. So what should be done with passed pawns?
Push.
Yeah. I have no idea what was wrong with this move. Next, you can play maybe rook to c1 at some point, place for c7. I think these pawns are just going to become way too strong. And the nice thing about pushing pawns is sometimes it's a good way to cut down on counterplay. Because if you push pawns, what does your opponent have to do? They have to respond. They have to defend. And if your opponent's just kind of sitting there defending against your pawns, do you think they're going to be able to create any counter threats? Probably not, right? So sometimes the best way to win cleanly, to cut out counterplay, is actually just to push your extra pawns. Sometimes it goes a long way. The danger, of course, is that you overextend or you don't play it quite right, and sometimes they can fall. But as long as the pawns remain defended and remain strong, I think that's just the best way. So c6, I think, would have been better. He played queen c3, which is kind of tricky. He might want to move his knight and play d5 and try to take advantage of the king. But I think that's a much trickier way to play. So black finds a nice move, rook a2. So black's trying to get some counterplay, clearly. And again, I suspect that there wasn't much time. Players like this, of course, are very strong, but they're still human beings. But definitely some mistakes happen now. Yeah, here white played knight d3, which I actually think is a big error. And could have actually changed the game in black's favor. The question is, what should you play here? Because the position's changed now. Rook a2 is a really nice active move, right? And keep in mind, the queen on c4 covered the a2 square, which means that this move would not have been possible. So again, I think that Wesley could have just pushed, but he got a little too attracted to this, I don't know, queen discovering the king thing. It's actually easy to do. You can get lured into playing moves like this because you're like, I'm going to go for checkmate. Sometimes this doesn't work. But I suspect he just miscalculated something. But we're not going to do that, obviously. So what can white do here? C6 is possible, but here I'd say it's not so clear. Because now I can put the rook behind the pawn. And that makes a big difference, right? Because now the pawns can definitely become weak. For example, next move maybe queen e4. I might be able to just sack and try to liquidate the pawns and draw that way too. So the pawns are not going to be nearly as strong as with the queen on c4 behind the pawns, right? Does that make sense? So I suspect that knight c4 would lead to similar problems that happen in the game, which I'll show you later. But knight c4 I don't think is the right approach. I actually think this knight on e5 is a very important piece. Any guesses why? Very nice. It blocks the rook on e8 from getting in the game. In the game, black could have gotten this rook in and actually have taken the advantage. So the key is, you want to keep this knight on e5 just to keep this rook out. Again, the queen and rook may look kind of annoying, but just the two of them are not going to create any massive threats. If this rook gets in and then there's three heavy pieces aiming at f2, it's going to be an annoyance to say the least. So, queen c4 going back.
Yeah, trying to d5, stops f6.
So, stops f6, going to get the queen to d5. This makes sense. So let's see. Probably I would play rook c2, I'd imagine. Queen d5. This looks playable. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what black should do, but maybe rook b8 here.
I don't really know, I guess pushing c6. I'm not really certain like how I'd make progress.
The problem is I have rook b1 in some positions as well. Maybe not here because you guard g2, but even just rook b2. So for example, c6, rook b2, and now the pawn on f2 is pretty weak. And the problem is, again, your pawn just can't go anywhere because I kind of control all the squares.
Right.
So it's a very natural way to play. The move I came up with was actually very strange. It was g4.
That's what she was gonna say.
Okay, but why g4?
Well, you want to kick his queen away so you can't play rook c2 anymore.
Very nice. And sometimes it's that simple. If queen e4, the rook can go to e1 because there's no mate threat anymore. It looks like it opens up your king, but really your king was weak also with the pawn on f2, right? The queen on f5 was just such a perfect piece. So sometimes you just have to kick it away. Shoo it away, and then it's actually not so easy. Actually, after queen e4, there's also queen b3 moves with the rook and pawn on f7 being hit. So there are lots of possibilities. But g4 actually was the only move that really... Knight d3 was actually a big mistake. And why?
Rook e2.
Very nice. And if d5 checked, f6. And the problem is that even though these two connected pawns look like they're just going to run, the problem is that black can play rook c2, rook d2, and notice how black is the one with the active pieces. So even though you have two pawns rolling up the board, probably the rooks are just going to get behind them and take them. And white's going to have a hard time. So you see how easily a game where it looked like white had everything under control, right? White had the queen on c4, white was ready to push the pawns, everything was great. But you allow your opponent to activate their pieces just a little bit, it can turn the tide so heavily. Because here, I mean, this position just looks really annoying. Because this rook has to stay on f1 because of the f2 stuff. The rooks are just going to come behind. These pawns are actually just going to be weak. So this could have actually cost the US basically the gold had we lost this match. So, and we might have lost out on tiebreaks to Russia, so it landed in the bronze. So it could have been that big of a swing, not just in the game, but in the whole match. To give you an idea of the stresses of team events. Imagine your coach has the computer on watching this game going like, ah. That's basically what a coach does there.
Who were the coaches for this event?
So in this case, for the men's event, Alex Lenderman was the coach. And John Donaldson, as usual, was the captain who handles the logistics. He's very, very good with that. And for the women, Robert Hess was the coach, and the captain was Yasser Serhan. So we had a lot of nice teams, but not just nice teams, but very good people backing them up. So just to finish off here, black missed the chance. And remember, you're playing an opponent, especially an opponent this strong, you're not going to get many chances. So he played queen to f6, which is not as strong. Wesley kicked the rook away. Played knight d5. Knight c7. So here, black got a little too adventurous. Black probably was in time pressure, was panicking, was like, oh, I'm going to lose the game if these pawns start rolling. So he's like, take that. Looks like kind of a nasty move, right? Because if pawn takes, then there's mate. Queen takes is probably going to lose all your pawns. So it's not such a easy situation, but Wesley doesn't panic. And I've noticed this is one of his strengths as a player. No matter how crazy the position is, I don't think his heart rate goes above 70. He's very, very calm. You know, he might look a little nervous sometimes, but the way he plays, he never panics. And I think that's one of the things that makes him so strong. And it's a trait we should all try to emulate, I think. He just does not panic no matter how crazy things look. So he played his queen back to c1, pinning the rook, which I think was a nice move. Yeah. And here, black kind of went astray. I think that he didn't like his position. Even here, his position's not so easy. Not so easy for white to just win here or anything like that. h6 was a fine move, keeping the queen defended so that the rook can move. So yeah, h4 turned out to be a good move, but again, getting in very tricky territory here. Played d5. And here, black just blundered. He played queen e5. Had he played rook d3 and played kind of more normally, I think this is not so easy for white to win here. In fact, I'm not even sure white's better. Because again, even though you have the connected passers, which again, as I've told you, the knight and two pawns I'd take over the rook most of the time when the pawns are rolling like this. But in a position where white has the passive rook, black's rooks are super active, not so easy. So I'd say this position is definitely, would have been okay for black. But again, I think he just panicked and blundered. He played this move. So the key is, what exactly is the blunder? And by the way, the answer is not just, oh, he forgot his rook was hanging. If that was your answer, you can put your hand down.
Well, you do take the rook,
But what's the idea? After takes rook, queen g3. You're about to get mated. By the way, if you take that rook, you better have in your mind exactly why you're not getting mated. If you take the rook and then start thinking, we got a lot of problems.
because you're mating first,
Queen a1, huh? Yeah. Knight e6 actually turns out also to be a good move, but queen a1 is very nice. So the idea is that after... so for example, if king h7, what happens?
Knight takes f7.
Correct. And if king here? Mm-hmm. Very nice. By the way, these are sometimes the easiest moves to miss. Queens, it's a really weird thing, but long queen moves. Everyone can miss long queen moves. It's easy to see like a rook moving far or a bishop moving far, but a queen moving far just blows our minds for some reason. Where we see a long queen move. I actually had this happen. It was against a GM, and it was like a really complex position. And I had this move queen h3 to a3 attacking an f8 rook, and he can't defend it. And that was how the game ended. And it was just, I mean, this was a super strong player, but you know, the long queen move, it's just really hard to see.
Wait, so h3 to f3?
To a3. Yeah. And it's for some reason, it's just hard to see. So you have to sometimes put an extra effort. And my guess would be that maybe he just panicked and had no time. It's very possible. But yeah, he probably missed that this queen a1 to a8 check thing was possible. But okay, you're not done yet. King g7.
96.
Knight e6 is possible. You could also play knight e8.
96 will be.
And then after the king moves, probably say to g8 or f8, you play knight f6 check. And it's over. However, if you wanted to be truly mean to your opponent, rather than mate them, you could play this move.
Yeah.
And then the queen, again, proves that it's a long distance piece.
That's not fair.
No, it's not fair. It really isn't. So after queen a1 check, black resigned. Okay, so basically the things to learn from these games, like, okay, there were two very, very different games that happened in the same match, right? The first game, the captain had to really like watching that first game. Fabiano got a great position out of the opening, just started, everything was smooth, he got his pieces out, queen went to e1, he was careful, he calculated properly, but it was just a smooth, easy win, just based on his position. This game was not a smooth, easy win. He got a decent position, but you saw how crazy it got. But one of the key things that he did well, which his opponent didn't do as well as he did, was that he just remained calm. When the position changed, he realized it. He's like, okay, I have to be careful now. I have to change my tactics. I have to change my thinking. But one of the things you'll notice, and this is, again, something GMs do very well, particularly elite GMs, is that if they make one mistake, they don't make another right after it. If you watch games of, like sometimes lower rated players, what they'll do is if they make one mistake, they'll make another mistake, they'll make another mistake, all in a row. And it's because they don't correct their thinking after the first mistake. Once he saw that the rook could get to e2, he was like, oh no, I'm not allowing this. Knight b4, get your rook out. This move, get your rook out. And he immediately repaired his position. And even in time trouble, he was able to do this very effectively. But anyway, it was quite a cool victory. I did not stay up till 6 a.m. Get up at 2 a.m. stay up till 6 a.m. to see the end of the match. I'm not that addicted, but it was still, I'm sure it was a cool thing to witness. And again, I mean, it hasn't happened in a long time. So we had a very, very strong team this year. I mean, to have Wesley So on board 3 is pretty impressive. I don't think most teams can have 3 top 10 players, but it's still never easy. Like, Russia always has an amazing team, but they sometimes struggle to win. So the fact that we were able to win was a pretty cool thing. Anyway, any last questions? Yes.
Like, why choose a younger player than someone more experienced?
That's a good question. To be perfectly honest, sometimes the answer is which coaches know the players better.
Okay.
So if a coach, like if a player is known to the players or coaches want it, sometimes it makes it easier. But the players vote on who the coach is, so it's always a player decision. It's not always unanimous, just because not everyone agrees. But in this case, actually, usually for the women, I know that it's usually Melik goes,
Right,
and
yeah.
Yuri Schulman are the two very common ones. But I think Yuri wasn't available or didn't want to do it, and Melik also had some conflicts. It was in Azerbaijan, so he couldn't make it. So they had to choose new people, and they thought, Yasser and Robert had never done it, and they thought, okay, Robert would bring some energy, Yasser would bring some experience, it could be a good combo. And the women also had a pretty good event. They were very close. A couple results either way, they could have medaled. For the men, I'm not really sure. When you have players this strong, it feels kind of weird to have Lenderman's a great player, but is he Hikaru's strength? No. So it's kind of difficult, but usually they pick people who know how to prepare very well. Like they can prepare lots of lines, and they have lots of knowledge about things like that. And then the captain, for John Donaldson, he doesn't really prepare the players usually, but he's great with logistics. He knows all the rest hotels. He knows where to go for restaurants. He knows where the closest restrooms are to every place. It's the guy he's very detail oriented. So
Do they still